Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the brutal reality of 1534 England, where winter wasn't just cold, it was a 6-month death sentence that most people barely survived. A world where the wrong decision about salt ratios could kill your entire family, where sharing your bed with livestock wasn't weird but essential, and where the most powerful landlords after the king were monks who controlled your every move. We're diving deep into how ordinary tenant farmers survived when nature, feudalism, and the Catholic Church all conspired against them. Picture your worst day at work. Now multiply that by 180 days, add the constant threat of starvation, and remove every modern comfort you've ever known. Welcome to Tudor England, where you're about to become a tenant farmer working land you'll never own, for masters who see you as barely more valuable than the livestock you sleep next to. Forget everything you think you know about simpler times. The truth? You probably wouldn't last 2 weeks as a medieval farmer, and winter would finish you off in days. So before we dive into this frozen nightmare together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for some seriously dark history about survival, starvation, and the monasteries that controlled it all. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. It's incredible to see who's brave enough to explore these dark chapters with me. Whether you're staying up late, having morning coffee, or settling in for the evening wherever you are. Now dim those lights, maybe grab something warm to drink. Picture the acrid smell of wood smoke mixed with unwashed bodies, the bite of frost in the air that makes your lungs burn, and the gnawing fear in your stomach that never, ever goes away. Let's step into this nightmare together, your eyes open to what might genuinely be your last comfortable morning for the next 6 months. The year is 1534. Henry VIII is king, and you've just awakened in a world where winter doesn't mean cranking up the thermostat. It means a daily battle against death itself. You're lying on a straw mattress that's more dirt than straw, and the first thing that hits you isn't the cold, it's the smell. A nauseating blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat manure, wood smoke, and something you desperately hope isn't rotting meat but probably is. Your house is essentially a wooden box with gaps between the planks that let in wind, rain, and snow. The floor is packed dirt mixed with straw that hasn't been changed in months because fresh straw is a luxury you can't afford. But here's the medieval reality that would shock you most. You're not alone in this cramped space. Your family is here, obviously, but so are your most valuable possessions, your livestock. That cow breathing in your face, she's not a pet. She's a heating system, a milk producer, and potentially your winter meat supply all rolled into one. Her body heat is literally keeping you from freezing to death in your sleep. You sit up, and immediately your back reminds you that medieval life has no mercy for human bodies. You've been sleeping on straw for years, working bent over in fields since you could walk, and your spine feels like it belongs to someone twice your age. But you can't rest. Outside your window, you can see your breath in the air, and that means one thing: winter is coming, and you are catastrophically unprepared. The monastery bells are ringing in the distance, calling the monks to their morning prayers. But those bells aren't just marking holy hours, they're marking time you're losing. Every hour that passes without preparation is an hour closer to potential starvation. Because here's what modern people don't understand about medieval winter. It's not just cold. It's a siege that lasts half the year. And if you haven't gathered enough supplies, you simply die. You stumble outside into the grey September morning, and immediately you're hit with calculations that would break a modern mind. How many pounds of grain does your family need to survive until May? How much firewood can you gather before the ground freezes? How many animals can you afford to feed through winter versus how many you need to slaughter now? These aren't abstract math problems. They're life and death equations that medieval people solved every autumn. Get the numbers wrong, and your children starve. Miscalculate your firewood needs, and you freeze. Slaughter too many animals, and you have no breeding stock for next year. Slaughter too few, and you can't feed them all, so they starve anyway, and you lose the meat. Your family's survival depends on about 8 bushels of grain per person for the winter months. That sounds manageable until you realize you don't own the land you farm. You're a tenant, which means the monastery gets the first cut of everything you produce. You pay rent in grain, in labor, in whatever the monks demand. What's left over, if anything is left over, is what keeps you alive. Standing in your doorway, looking out at the strips of land scattered across the open fields, you can see other families beginning their own desperate preparations. But here's the thing that would terrify you most about medieval farming. You're all in this together, but you're also competing for survival. If your neighbor's crop fails, they'll be begging for food from yours. If your crop fails, well, begging is about the only option you have. You grab your sickle, a blade so dull it's barely sharper than a spoon because good metal costs more than most people see in a lifetime, and head out to the fields. But these aren't your fields. Medieval farming operated on an open field system that would seem insane to modern people. Picture this. Instead of one big farm, you get narrow strips scattered randomly across massive communal fields. Your barley strip might be next to someone else's oats, followed by another person's beans. Why this seemingly inefficient system? Because it's insurance against disaster. If a storm hits one area, or disease strikes one section, not everyone loses everything at once. You start cutting barley, and within minutes you understand why medieval people age so fast. This isn't weekend gardening. This is back-breaking labor with primitive tools under time pressure that modern people can't imagine. Every stroke of the sickle has to be perfect because you can't afford to waste grain by cutting too high and leaving kernels on the stalk. The work is organized in a way that shows how desperately medieval communities needed each other to survive. Men do the cutting because it requires the most strength. Women follow behind, gathering the cut stalks and binding them into sheaves, bundles that can be carried and stored. Children scramble around collecting every loose grain that falls, because even those scattered kernels could mean the difference between eating and starving in February. This isn't a quaint family activity. This is war against time, weather, and death itself. Every hour of daylight is precious because, once the autumn rains start in earnest, anything you haven't harvested will rot in the fields. And when your grain rots, you don't just lose a crop, you lose your life. But here's where medieval life gets even more brutal. Even the poor get to participate in this harvest through something called gleaning. After the landowners have taken their grain, the desperate are allowed to walk through the fields and collect whatever's left, individual kernels, broken stalks, anything edible. For the poorest families, this gleaning could provide a week's worth of food. In a world where most people are always 1 week away from starvation, that gleaning is the difference between surviving winter and becoming another casualty. Once you've cut your grain, the real challenge begins, keeping it from rotting before you can eat it. Medieval people had to become experts in food preservation because there was no backup plan. No grocery stores, no emergency services, no government aid. If your food spoiled, you died. The barley sheaves get stood upright in the fields in a process called stooking. This isn't just for show, it's sophisticated agricultural technology. By standing the sheaves upright with the heads pointing up, you allow air to circulate around the grain while protecting it from ground moisture. The grain continues to dry and cure. developing the low moisture content that prevents rot during storage. But even this simple process could kill you if done wrong. Stack the sheaves too tightly, and moisture gets trapped, leading to mold that ruins the grain. Leave them too loose, and rain soaks through, causing the same problem. Space them too far apart, and animals eat your winter food supply. Medieval farmers had to get this exactly right, every time, with no room for error. Then comes storage, which is where medieval people really showed their ingenuity, born of desperation. You can't just throw grain in a pile and hope for the best. First, you need to create a barrier that keeps out the mice and rats that would otherwise eat your entire winter food supply. The solution? Gorse. Gorse is a thorny, spiky plant that's miserable to handle but perfect for creating a natural pest barrier. You spread layers of gorse on the floor of your storage area, creating a bed of spikes that mice and rats can't cross. It's like medieval barbed wire, but it also allows air circulation under your grain stores. Handle gorse for a few hours, and your hands are bleeding from dozens of tiny puncture wounds. But without it, rodents would eat everything you've worked all year to produce. But grain is only half the survival equation. You also need protein to make it through winter, which means preserving meat. And preserving meat means salt, one of the most valuable and expensive commodities in medieval Europe. Most salt was imported from France or Spain, making it incredibly expensive for ordinary people. We're talking about a substance so valuable that people literally fought wars over it. For a medieval farmer, buying enough salt to preserve a winter's worth of meat could cost more than everything else you owned combined. So you have two choices: buy expensive imported salt and probably go into debt that could destroy your family, or make your own salt and slowly kill yourself in the process. Making salt means boiling seawater or brine in lead pans over roaring fires for hours at a time. The lead pans are soft enough to work, but toxic enough to poison you. Though nobody knows that yet. You're inhaling toxic fumes, working in brutal heat, and handling materials that are literally killing you. But without salt, your family starves when the preserved meat runs out in February. The process is mind-numbingly repetitive and dangerous. Bucket after bucket of brine gets poured into your lead pan. You maintain a roaring fire underneath, boiling away water and concentrating the salt. Your eyes stream from the smoke, your lungs burn from the fumes, and your hands crack and bleed from the constant heat and salt exposure. After hours of this torture, salt crystals finally begin forming on the surface of the boiling brine. You scrape them off with wooden tools, trying not to contaminate your precious salt with ash from the fire. The quality of your salt determines how well your meat preserves, which determines whether your family survives winter. Different grades of salt had different uses and different prices. The greyest, dirtiest salt was used for cleaning and the least important preservation. Cleaner, whiter salt was reserved for preserving the meat your family would actually eat. The cleanest salt was used for preserving cheese and other valuable foods. To purify salt, medieval people discovered they could add protein to the boiling brine, usually ox blood, but sometimes eggs if blood wasn't available. The proteins would bind with impurities, clumping them together so they could be skimmed off the surface. It's actually sophisticated chemistry, developed by people who understood the practical results even if they didn't understand the scientific principles. October arrives, and now comes one of the most heartbreaking aspects of medieval winter survival: deciding which animals live and which animals die. This isn't modern farming where you can buy feed and keep animals comfortable through winter. Medieval farmers had no winter feed, no heated barns, no veterinary care. Most animals simply couldn't survive winter, so you had to make brutal choices. You look at your ox, the animal that's helped you plow your fields all year. your partner in the back-breaking work of farming. This ox has probably been with your family for years. You know his personality, his moods, his favorite spots to scratch, and now you have to kill him. It's not cruelty, it's mathematics. You can't feed an ox through winter. If you try, the ox will slowly starve to death anyway, losing weight and meat quality while consuming resources you need for your own survival. Better to slaughter him now while he's healthy and preserve the meat for winter protein. The slaughter process would horrify modern people. You don't have professional butchers with proper tools and training. You have whatever sharp implements you can get, basic knowledge passed down from your parents, and the desperate need to not waste a single usable part of the animal. Nothing gets wasted because nothing can be wasted. The blood gets saved for making blood sausages. The organs get eaten immediately because they spoil fastest. The bones get boiled for broth and then ground up for bone meal. The hide gets processed into leather for repairs. Even the bladder gets cleaned and used as a storage container. The actual butchering has to be done in a specific way for preservation. Modern butchers cut meat into the joints, and cuts we recognize: steaks, roasts, chops. Medieval butchers cut meat into equal-sized chunks that would fit into preservation barrels. It didn't matter if one person got mostly fat and another got mostly lean meat, as long as everyone got their proper weight allocation. Once you have your meat cut into chunks, the real preservation process begins. This is where medieval housewives showed their expertise, because getting this wrong meant watching your family starve to death. First, every surface of every piece of meat gets rubbed with salt. You're trying to draw out the moisture that allows bacteria to grow and spoil the meat. The salt dehydrates the meat, creating an environment where harmful bacteria can't survive. But you have to use the right amount. Too little salt and the meat spoils. Too much salt and you waste your precious salt supply while making the meat inedible. After the initial salting, the meat goes into brine, a mixture of water, salt, and herbs that you've boiled and then cooled. The brine continues the preservation process, allowing salt to penetrate deeper into the meat tissues. The meat stays in this brine for several days, with the exact timing depending on the size of the pieces and the strength of your brine. Finally, the meat gets packed into barrels with dry salt for long-term storage. This is your winter protein supply, and it has to last until spring. Throughout the winter, you'll pull out pieces of this preserved meat, rinse off the salt, and cook it into stews that provide the protein your family needs to survive. The herbs added to the brine aren't just for flavor, they're preservation aids and primitive antibiotics. Medieval people had learned through centuries of trial and error which plants help prevent spoilage. Rosemary, thyme, sage. These weren't just seasonings, they were survival tools. But here's what makes your situation even more precarious. You're not just fighting against nature. You're also fighting against the economic system that controls your life. The monastery that owns your land isn't some humble collection of poor monks. They're one of the most powerful economic forces in England, controlling vast amounts of agricultural land and running what amounts to a medieval corporation. The monasteries own about a third of all the agricultural land in England. They control mines, waterways, forests, and have a virtual monopoly on the wool trade. They're not just your landlord, they're your banker, your employer, your government, and your spiritual authority all rolled into one. And they want their cut of everything you produce. Regardless of whether you survive winter or not, your rent gets paid in multiple ways. Part of it is grain from your harvest, grain your family desperately needs to eat. Part of it is labor, days you spend working monastery land instead of preparing for your own survival. Part of it might be money, which you probably don't have much of. and part of it is whatever special obligations the monastery has decided to impose. The monks justify this system by providing services that keep medieval society functioning. They run schools, though most peasants can't afford to send their children. They provide medical care, though medieval medicine is often more dangerous than the diseases it treats. They organize community events and religious festivals that provide psychological relief from the grinding hardship of daily life. But ultimately, the monastery's interests and your survival interests don't always align. They want maximum profit from their land holdings. You want to keep enough of your own production to not starve. This tension plays out every harvest season, with monks calculating exactly how much they can extract without causing their tenant farmers to abandon the land entirely. Medieval people weren't primitive. They were incredibly sophisticated within the constraints of their technology. Take something as simple as fire management, which was literally a life or death skill that took years to master. You can't just light a fire and let it burn all night. Wood is too valuable and scarce. Instead, you have to bank your fire, carefully arranging logs and ashes so the fire burns slowly and steadily through the night without consuming too much fuel. Get this wrong, and you either waste precious firewood or wake up to a cold house that could kill you. Fire management also means understanding different types of wood and what they're good for. Oak burns hot and long, but is hard to ignite. Pine lights easily, but burns fast and creates dangerous sparks. Birch bark makes excellent kindling, but produces toxic smoke if you burn too much. Knowing which wood to use when could mean the difference between a warm house and a burned-down house. Medieval people also had to become experts at reading weather patterns in ways that modern meteorologists would respect. Your survival depended on predicting when the first hard freeze would hit, when the worst storms would arrive, how much snow to expect. Get these predictions wrong, and you could lose livestock, run out of firewood, or get caught without adequate food supplies. You learn to read cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and subtle changes in temperature and humidity that warned of coming weather changes. This wasn't folklore. It was empirical observation developed over generations of people whose lives depended on accurate weather prediction. While the men focused on the heavy labor of farming, medieval women managed the household economy that actually kept families alive through winter. This was incredibly complex work that required expertise in food management, medicine, textile production, and resource allocation. Medieval housewives had to know exactly how much food their family needed per day, week, and month to survive until spring. They managed the brewing of ale, which wasn't a luxury, but a necessity because water was often contaminated with deadly bacteria. They knew which herbs could treat common illnesses and which ones would kill you if used incorrectly. They managed textile production, turning raw wool into cloth and then into clothing that could withstand months of brutal cold. They knew how to repair and re-repair clothing until no original fabric remained, because new cloth was expensive and often unavailable during winter months. These women also managed pregnancies and childbirth without any real medical support, in conditions that would horrify modern people. Medieval infant mortality was around 30%, and maternal mortality was similarly high. Yet somehow, enough children survived to continue the population. And they did all of this while facing the same hunger, cold, and constant threat of death as everyone else in the family. Medieval women weren't delicate creatures protected from harsh realities. They were survival experts who kept civilization functioning through knowledge, skill, and incredible determination. The monasteries weren't just religious institutions. They were technological and educational centers that preserved and advanced human knowledge during a period when most people couldn't read or write. Monasteries were at the forefront of agricultural innovation, experimenting with new crops, breeding techniques, and farming methods. They had the resources and long-term perspective needed for agricultural research, while ordinary farmers were too focused on immediate survival to experiment with unproven techniques. They were also centers of craft production that employed skilled artisans who created the beautiful buildings, artwork, and tools that defined medieval culture. Master masons, stonemasons, tile makers, metal workers, these craftsmen depended on monastery patronage for their livelihoods. The monasteries ran sophisticated economic operations that included mills, breweries, workshops, and trading networks that connected English agriculture to European markets. They were essentially medieval corporations with religious motivations and social responsibilities pure commercial enterprises didn't have. But this also made them incredibly wealthy and powerful, which would eventually lead to their downfall. By 1534, the monasteries controlled so much wealth and land that they represented a potential threat to royal authority and an irresistible target for a cash-strapped monarch like Henry VIII. Even in the face of approaching winter and potential death, medieval people knew how to find moments of celebration and community that kept them psychologically functional. Michaelmas, the feast of Saint Michael in late September, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter preparations. This wasn't just a party, it was a community-wide psychological survival mechanism. After months of back-breaking labor under constant stress, people needed release and celebration to maintain their mental health through the coming dark months. The feast featured the best food anyone would see for months: roasted goose fattened on grain stubble from the harvest, ale brewed from the new barley, fresh bread made from the best flour. For one night, people could forget about rationing and calorie calculations and actually eat until they were satisfied. But the celebration also included rituals that reinforced community bonds essential for winter survival. The Harvest Queen ceremony, where a young woman from the village rode on the last cart of grain, symbolized the community's shared success in securing food for winter. The games and competitions that followed the feast strengthened the social relationships that would be crucial for mutual aid during the hard months ahead. Mystery plays performed during these festivals weren't just entertainment, they were community theater that allowed ordinary people to participate in storytelling that gave meaning to their suffering. These plays, organized by local guilds, told religious stories but also reinforced the social bonds and shared values that held medieval communities together. The plays were also technological showcases, featuring elaborate special effects created with primitive pyrotechnics made from charcoal, saltpeter, and other available materials. These weren't professional productions but community efforts that demonstrated the creativity and resourcefulness that medieval people brought to every aspect of their lives. Medieval medicine was a dangerous mix of empirical observation, superstition, and desperation. With no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or proper sanitation, medical treatment often killed as many people as it saved. But medieval people did develop an impressive knowledge of herbal remedies that sometimes actually worked. The medical theory of the time was based on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was believed to result from imbalances among these humours, and treatment involved trying to restore balance through diet, herbal remedies, and procedures like bloodletting. Every plant was classified according to whether it was hot or cold, wet or dry, and was prescribed to counteract specific humoral imbalances. Hyssop, for example, was considered hot and dry, making it ideal for treating conditions involving excess phlegm, colds, coughs, and respiratory problems that were common during winter. Making herbal remedies required knowledge that was passed down through generations of women who served as informal community healers. They knew which plants to harvest, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and what dosages were safe. Get any of these wrong, and you could poison the patient instead of helping them. The monastery infirmaries served as hospitals for both the monastic community and local lay people who couldn't afford other medical care. These infirmaries were heated spaces where the sick could rest and recover, luxuries that most people's homes couldn't provide. But the medical care itself was still primitive and often dangerous. While tenant farmers struggled for daily survival, the monasteries employed skilled craftsmen who created some of the most beautiful and enduring architecture in human history. These craftsmen, masons, carvers, metalworkers, and tile makers represented the peak of medieval technology and artistry. Master masons worked with basic tools that would seem primitive to modern construction workers: hand axes, chisels, measuring devices, and geometric knowledge passed down through generations of craftsmen. Yet they created buildings that have lasted for centuries and continue to inspire awe today. The training system for these crafts was rigorous and exclusive. A young man hoping to become a mason would serve a 7-year apprenticeship, learning not just technical skills, but also the geometric principles and artistic traditions that guided medieval architecture. This wasn't just job training, it was initiation into a guild system that controlled access to skilled trades. Unlike that promptation to musidi, Wakanturdi of Ur of Mills of Version Spali, the tile makers who created the decorative floors of monasteries and churches worked with sophisticated techniques that required both artistic skill and technical knowledge. They created patterns that told religious stories, displayed heraldic symbols, and demonstrated the wealth and power of their patrons. These craftsmen depended entirely on monastery patronage for their livelihoods. The church was essentially the only institution with the resources and motivation to commission major building projects. When the monasteries were dissolved, most of these craftsmen would lose their employment and their traditional way of life would disappear. But even as you struggle through your daily survival routines in 1534, massive changes are already in motion that will destroy everything you've built your life around. Henry VIII's break with Rome isn't just a religious dispute, it's an economic revolution that will reshape English society. The monasteries represent an enormous concentration of wealth and land that the cash-strapped Tudor monarchy desperately needs. By dissolving the monasteries and seizing their assets, Henry VIII will acquire resources that can fund his military adventures and support his lavish court lifestyle. But for people like you, the dissolution will be catastrophic. The monasteries provided not just landlord services, but also education, medical care, poor relief, and employment for thousands of people. When they disappear, there will be no immediate replacement for these social services. The land that monasteries controlled will be sold to wealthy merchants and nobles, creating a new class of landlords who are motivated purely by profit rather than religious obligations to care for their tenants. This will make life even harder for tenant farmers who are already struggling at the margins of survival. The guild system that organized craft production and provided social support for skilled workers will also collapse when their monastery patrons disappear. Centuries-old traditions of craftsmanship and artistic production will be lost almost overnight. Even the community festivals and mystery plays that provided psychological relief from the hardships of medieval life will be suppressed as the new Protestant establishment views them as remnants of Catholic superstition. By December, if you've survived the harvest, the slaughter, the preservation process, and the constant threat of disease, you're now facing the worst part of medieval winter, the grinding, relentless cold and darkness that lasts for months. Your daily routine becomes a careful calculation of calories and warmth. You wake up before dawn not because you want to, but because every hour of weak winter sunlight is precious for the work that keeps you alive. You check your food stores, counting and recounting to make sure you're not consuming more than you can afford. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's an active enemy trying to kill you. It seeps through your inadequate clothing, which is basically layers of cloth and leather held together with hope and prayer. It turns water into ice, making basic tasks like drinking and washing incredibly difficult. Your hands crack and bleed from the cold, making any kind of manual work painful. And the hunger, modern people simply don't understand medieval hunger. This isn't missing a meal or going on a diet. This is your body slowly consuming itself, day after day, as you ration increasingly smaller portions of grain porridge and hope desperately that your preserved meat doesn't run out before spring. The psychological effects of this constant stress are as dangerous as the physical hardships. The long nights, the persistent hunger, the knowledge that any accident or illness could be fatal, all of this creates a mental burden that modern people would find unbearable. Yet somehow, medieval people found ways to maintain hope and community even during the darkest months. Storytelling by firelight, sharing resources when someone's supplies ran low, caring for sick neighbors even when you could barely care for yourself. These acts of mutual aid were what made survival possible. Your survival through winter depends on dozens of specialized skills that would seem like magic to modern people, but were basic knowledge for medieval farmers. You know exactly how to read the behavior of your animals to predict weather changes. Cows lying down means rain is coming. Chickens refusing to leave their roost indicates a severe storm approaching. Your ox becoming restless suggests that the barometric pressure is dropping and cold weather is on the way. You can tell by smell whether your preserved meat is still safe to eat or has begun to spoil. You know which herbs can be safely eaten when other food runs out and which ones will poison you. You can identify edible roots, bark, and other emergency foods that might keep you alive if your main food supplies fail. You understand fire in ways that go far beyond simply lighting logs. You know how to create charcoal for metalworking, how to maintain different types of fires for different purposes, how to use smoke for preserving food and driving away insects, and how to extinguish fires safely to prevent your house from burning down. You can repair almost anything with basic tools and whatever materials you can scavenge. Broken farming implements, torn clothing, damaged storage containers. Your survival depends on being able to fix things because replacement is usually impossible during winter months. These skills aren't hobbies or interesting historical facts. They're life and death knowledge that mean the difference between surviving winter and becoming another casualty of medieval life. While everyone acknowledges the physical hardships that medieval men faced, the challenges that medieval women overcame are often overlooked but were equally impressive and perhaps more complex. Medieval women managed household economies that required skills equivalent to running a small business. They had to calculate food needs months in advance, manage complex barter relationships with neighbors, allocate limited resources among competing needs, and make decisions that affected their family's survival. They were also the primary medical practitioners for their families and often their communities. They knew which herbs could treat specific ailments, how to prepare medicines, how to care for wounds and illnesses, and how to assist with childbirth. This knowledge was learned through apprenticeship and experience, and mistakes could be fatal. Textile production was almost entirely women's work and was essential for survival. Women had to know how to process raw wool into thread, weave thread into cloth, and sew cloth into clothing that could withstand months of harsh weather. They also had to know how to dye cloth, repair damaged garments, and repurpose old clothing into new items. But perhaps most importantly, medieval women served as the emotional and psychological center of their families. They maintained morale during the darkest months, resolved conflicts that could destroy family units, and provided the stability that allowed their families to function under incredible stress. But perhaps all of this was accomplished while dealing with the same hunger, cold, disease risk, and physical hardship as everyone else in the family, plus the additional challenges of pregnancy and child-rearing in an environment where both maternal and infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high. The monasteries that controlled your life weren't the simple religious communities that modern people often imagine. They were complex institutions that combined spiritual, economic, educational, and political functions in ways that made them incredibly powerful, but also vulnerable to political change. As spiritual institutions, monasteries provided the religious services that medieval people believed were essential for salvation. They offered masses for the dead, prayers for the living, and sanctuary for those who needed protection from secular authorities. This spiritual authority gave them influence that went far beyond their economic power. As economic institutions, monasteries were essentially medieval corporations that controlled vast amounts of agricultural land, operated mills and workshops, managed trading networks, and employed thousands of people. They were among the most efficient and productive economic units in medieval Europe. As educational institutions, monasteries preserved and transmitted knowledge during a period when literacy was rare and books were incredibly expensive. They maintained libraries, operated schools, and sponsored the scholars who advanced human understanding in fields ranging from agriculture to astronomy. But this concentration of power also made monasteries targets for secular rulers who resented their independence and coveted their wealth. The monasteries' loyalty to Rome rather than to English authority made them suspect in the eyes of increasingly nationalistic monarchs. By 1534, the monasteries controlled about one-third of all agricultural land in England and possessed wealth that rivaled the crown itself. This made them irresistible targets for Henry VIII, who needed money to fund his military campaigns and court expenses. Even in the depths of winter, medieval communities found ways to create moments of celebration that provided psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. These festivals weren't just entertainment, they were essential mental health interventions that helped people maintain hope during the darkest months. The mystery plays performed during winter festivals served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. They provided community involvement that strengthened social bonds essential for mutual survival. They offered opportunities for creative expression that allowed people to temporarily escape the grinding hardships of daily life, and they reinforced religious beliefs that gave meaning to suffering and hope for eventual salvation. The technical aspects of these performances were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval people created special effects using primitive pyrotechnics made from saltpeter, charcoal, and other available materials. They built elaborate sets and costumes using whatever resources they could gather. They organized complex productions that involved dozens of community members working together toward a common goal. The food and drink associated with these festivals represented precious calories and resources that were desperately needed for survival. But communities chose to waste these resources on celebration because they understood that psychological survival was as important as physical survival. The traditional drinks like melamel, fermented honey, and fruit provided both nutrition and the alcohol that helped people relax and forget their troubles temporarily. The brewing process also demonstrated the sophisticated fermentation knowledge that medieval people possessed. Medieval medicine was dangerous and often ineffective, but the herbal knowledge that medieval people accumulated over centuries did include some treatments that actually worked. Understanding which plants could help with winter illnesses was literally a matter of life and death. The process of creating herbal remedies required extensive knowledge that took years to master. You had to know when to harvest specific plants for maximum potency, how to dry and store them to preserve their medicinal properties, how to prepare them for different types of treatments, and what dosages were safe for different conditions. Hyssop, one of the most commonly used medieval medicinal plants, contains compounds that do have actual antimicrobial and expectorant properties. Medieval people didn't understand the scientific basis for its effectiveness, but centuries of experimentation had taught them that it helped with respiratory problems that were common during winter months. The honey used to prepare herbal remedies wasn't just a sweetener. Honey has natural antimicrobial properties that help preserve the medicines and may have provided some additional therapeutic benefit. The combination of herbal compounds and honey created preparations that were more effective than either component alone, but the psychological effect of having some form of medical treatment available was perhaps as important as any physical benefits. In a world where most illnesses couldn't be effectively treated, even marginally effective remedies provided hope and a sense of agency that helped people cope with the constant threat of disease. The skilled craftsmen who created the beautiful tile work, stone carving, and architectural details that decorated monasteries represented the peak of medieval technology and artistry. But their way of life was about to vanish along with their monastery patrons. The tile-making process that created the decorative floors of medieval churches required both artistic skill and technical knowledge that took years to master. The craftsmen had to understand clay composition, firing temperatures, glaze chemistry, and artistic design principles that were passed down through generations of guild members. Creating a single decorative tile was a complex process that could take hours. First, clay had to be prepared to exactly the right consistency and purity. Then it was pressed into wooden frames that ensured uniform size and thickness. Decorative patterns were impressed using carved wooden blocks, with each design carrying religious or heraldic significance. The most challenging part was creating the two-color designs that made medieval tiles so distinctive. The sunken areas of the pattern were filled with white clay slip that would turn yellow when fired. This required precise timing. Apply the slip too early and it wouldn't adhere properly. Too late and it wouldn't integrate with the base clay. After the initial shaping and decoration, each tile had to be carefully scraped to create clean edges between the different colored areas. This painstaking work took about 20 minutes per tile and required steady hands and artistic judgment. A single floor might require thousands of these individually crafted tiles. The firing process was equally critical and dangerous. Medieval kilns reached temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius using wood fires that had to be carefully maintained for days. Get the temperature wrong, and months of work could be ruined. The glazes that created the final colors were made from lead compounds that were toxic to work with, but created the brilliant yellows and greens that made medieval tiles so beautiful. These craftsmen knew they were creating work that would last for centuries, and they took pride in the artistic and technical excellence of their products. But they also knew that their livelihoods depended entirely on monastery patronage. When the monasteries disappeared, so would the demand for their specialized skills. As winter deepened and the cold began taking its toll on bodies already weakened by inadequate nutrition, medieval people turned to herbal remedies that represented their best hope against the diseases that killed so many during the harsh months. The monastery infirmaries served as the closest thing to hospitals that most people would ever see. These were heated buildings, an incredible luxury when most people's homes were barely warmer than the outdoor air. The infirm could rest in actual beds with clean straw mattresses, eat food prepared specifically for invalids, and receive care from monks who had some medical training. But even monastery medicine was primitive and dangerous by modern standards. The medical theory of the four humors led to treatments that often made patients worse. Bloodletting, purging, and other procedures designed to rebalance the humors frequently weakened people who were already struggling with illness and malnutrition. The herbal preparations that medieval people relied on were a mixture of folk wisdom, religious belief, and genuine pharmacological knowledge. Some remedies, like willow bark for pain relief, contained compounds that modern medicine recognizes as effective. Others, like bloodstone for stopping bleeding, were based on sympathetic magic and probably did more harm than good. The process of preparing these medicines was itself risky. Many plants that had medicinal properties also had toxic compounds that could kill if the dosage was wrong. Medieval healers had to learn through experience and observation which preparations were safe and effective, often making mistakes that cost lives. Women typically served as the primary medical practitioners for their families and communities, learning herbal lore from their mothers and grandmothers. This knowledge was considered so valuable that it was carefully guarded and passed down only to trusted individuals who had proven their reliability and judgment. The magnificent stone buildings that the monasteries constructed weren't just places of worship, they were statements of power, wealth, and technological sophistication that demonstrated the monastery's central role in medieval society. Master masons who worked on these projects underwent 7-year apprenticeships that taught them not just stone-working techniques, but also the geometric principles and architectural traditions that guided medieval construction. These men were among the most educated and skilled workers in medieval society, capable of designing and building structures that have lasted for centuries. The tools they used were deceptively simple: hand axes, chisels, measuring devices, and their own knowledge of proportion and geometry. Yet with these basic implements, they created architectural features of incredible complexity and beauty. Flying buttresses that distributed weight in ways that allowed for soaring interior spaces, carved details that required both artistic vision and technical precision, and structural innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with stone construction. The logistics of medieval construction projects were mind-boggling. Stone had to be quarried, often from sites many miles away, and transported using primitive carts and human labor. The stone was easiest to work when it was green, fresh from the quarry, and still containing natural moisture that made it softer. This meant that construction schedules had to be coordinated with quarrying operations and transportation capabilities. The masons worked in teams organized according to strict hierarchies based on skill and experience. Master masons designed the overall structure and supervised the work. Journeymen executed the more complex stonework. Apprentices performed the basic labor and learned the trade through observation and practice. These construction projects provided employment for hundreds of people beyond the masons themselves. Laborers quarried and transported stone. Carpenters built scaffolding and forms. Metalworkers created the tools and hardware needed for construction, and countless other specialists contributed their skills to these massive undertakings. But the economic model that supported this construction was entirely dependent on the monastery's wealth and power. When the monasteries were dissolved, the demand for skilled stonemasons would largely disappear, and centuries-old traditions of architectural craftsmanship would be lost almost overnight. The mystery plays that provided entertainment and community bonding during the darkest winter months were organized by guilds, professional associations that controlled craft production and provided social support for their members. These guilds were about to lose their primary patrons when the monasteries disappeared. Each guild was responsible for a specific play in the mystery cycle, usually chosen to reflect their particular craft. Carpenters performed the crucifixion because they worked with wood. Bakers performed the Last Supper because they dealt with bread. Farmers like yourself performed plays about salvation and rebirth because those themes resonated with agricultural cycles. The guilds provided not just entertainment but also economic organization that made medieval craft production possible. They controlled access to trades through the apprenticeship system, maintained quality standards that protected both craftsmen and consumers, and provided mutual aid for members who faced illness, injury, or economic hardship. Guild membership was exclusive and valuable. Only guild members could practice certain trades within a town's boundaries, giving them monopoly protection in exchange for maintaining standards and providing community services. The guilds also provided social identity and status that gave craftsmen dignity and respect within medieval society. The religious aspects of guild organization weren't just ceremonial, they were central to medieval concepts of work and social responsibility. Guild members were expected to pray for each other's souls, care for each other's widows and orphans, and maintain the moral standards that medieval people believed were necessary for social stability. But the guild system was also closely tied to the Catholic Church and its institutional structure. Guild chapels, religious ceremonies, and charitable activities all depended on Catholic theology and practice. When Henry VIII broke with Rome and began suppressing Catholic institutions, the guilds would lose much of their religious foundation and social purpose. By March, if you've somehow survived the winter, you're a fundamentally different person than the one who went to sleep in September. The months of hunger have aged you in ways that go beyond physical appearance. You've learned things about yourself and about human nature that comfortable people never discover. You know exactly how little food you can survive on, how much cold your body can endure, and what it feels like to face the genuine possibility of death every single day. You've watched neighbors die from diseases that proper nutrition might have prevented, seen children fail to survive the winter despite their families' desperate efforts, and made choices about resource allocation that will haunt you for the rest of your life. But you've also experienced forms of community solidarity that modern people rarely encounter. You've shared your last piece of bread with a neighbor whose supplies ran out. You've sat vigil with dying friends, cared for their children when they couldn't, and received similar care when you needed it most. But our supplies and find totally most. The skills you've developed aren't just practical knowledge, they're survival instincts that have become part of your identity. You automatically calculate calorie content when you look at food, assess weather patterns constantly for signs of danger, and maintain awareness of your resource levels that never completely relaxes. The psychological changes are as profound as the physical ones. You've developed a relationship with death that's intimate and immediate rather than abstract and distant. You understand that life is fragile and precious in ways that can't be learned from books or stories. You've also developed reserves of determination and resilience that you never knew you possessed. As spring approaches and you begin to see signs that you might actually survive another year, you also know that everything you've built your life around is about to change. The monastery bells that have marked the rhythm of your days for your entire life will soon fall silent. The economic system that has exploited you but also provided structure and security will disappear. The community traditions that have sustained you through the darkest months will be suppressed as remnants of Catholic superstition. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1540 wasn't just a religious reformation, it was the end of a way of life that had organized English society for nearly 1,000 years. For people like you, who had never known any other system, the changes would be catastrophic and disorienting. The land that had been controlled by monasteries for centuries was sold to wealthy merchants and nobles who had no religious obligations to care for their tenants. These new landlords were motivated purely by profit, and they quickly discovered that they could make more money by converting agricultural land to sheep pasture for wool production than by maintaining traditional farming communities. This led to the enclosure movement that displaced thousands of farming families from land their ancestors had worked for generations. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned as landlords evicted tenants to make room for sheep. The open field system that had provided some protection against total crop failure was replaced by enclosed fields that offered no such security. The social services that monasteries had provided, education, medical care, poor relief, employment for skilled craftsmen, largely disappeared with no immediate replacement. It would take generations for secular institutions to develop the capacity to provide these services, leaving several generations of people without the support systems they had always relied on. The guild system that had organized craft production and provided social support for skilled workers also collapsed when their monastery patrons disappeared. Centuries-old traditions of craftsmanship were lost as demand for luxury goods declined, and new Protestant authorities viewed elaborate decoration as wasteful vanity. Even the community festivals and cultural traditions that had helped people cope with the hardships of medieval life were suppressed as the new Protestant establishment viewed them as remnants of Catholic superstition. The mystery plays, harvest celebrations, and religious ceremonies that had provided meaning and community solidarity were forbidden or abandoned. Today, you can still visit the ruins of the monasteries that once controlled medieval English life. Places like Fountains Abbey, Revolts Abbey, and hundreds of others stand as empty shells of what were once thriving communities that combined spiritual, economic, and social functions in ways that modern institutions rarely match. Walking through these ruins, it's hard to imagine the bustling activity that once filled these spaces. The dormitories where monks slept, the kitchens that fed hundreds of people daily, the workshops where skilled craftsmen created beautiful objects, the infirmaries where the sick received care, all of it reduced to broken walls and empty spaces. But the impact of the monastic age goes far beyond these physical remains. The agricultural techniques developed by monastery farmers, the architectural innovations created by monastery builders, the educational traditions maintained by monastery scholars, all of these contributions shaped the development of English civilization in ways that continue to influence modern life. The legal and administrative systems that monasteries developed to manage their vast holdings provided models for later secular institutions. The accounting methods they used to track complex economic transactions laid foundations for modern business practices. The agricultural innovations they pioneered increased food production in ways that supported population growth and economic development. Before Medorbo de Salpsontur, Becleith the Ampensis first of Bisden to Mans, former times, de Ino the Ampensis firm, the Amperie Cairn. Perhaps most importantly, the monasteries demonstrated that institutions could successfully combine spiritual, economic, and social functions in ways that served both individual needs and community welfare. Modern society, with its strict separation between religious, economic, and social institutions, has never quite recovered the integrated approach to human needs that the monasteries represented. The ordinary people who survived the transition from monastic to secular landlordship carried forward knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions that had sustained their communities for generations. Though the institutional framework changed, many of the practical skills and social relationships that had made survival possible continued in new forms. The herbal knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted by medieval women didn't disappear with the monasteries. It continued to be passed down through families and communities until it was eventually displaced by modern medicine. The agricultural techniques developed on monastery farms were adopted by secular landlords who recognized their effectiveness. The craftsmanship traditions that had created the beautiful buildings and decorative objects of the monastic age found new patrons among wealthy merchants and nobles who wanted to display their status through elaborate buildings and furnishings. Though the religious motivation was gone, the technical skills and artistic traditions continued. The community solidarity that had helped medieval people survive the harshest conditions didn't disappear either. It evolved into new forms of mutual aid and social organization that helped people adapt to the changed circumstances. The guilds might have lost their religious foundation, but the principle of workers organizing to protect their interests and provide mutual support continued in different forms. Most importantly, the people who survived this transition carried forward a deep understanding of human resilience and the importance of community that came from having faced genuine hardship together. They knew that survival depended not just on individual effort, but on social cooperation and mutual aid that transcended immediate self-interest. The monastery walls still stand in ruins across England today, silent witnesses to a world that vanished almost overnight when Henry VIII decided he needed their wealth more than their services. What you experienced, that careful balance of community, faith, desperate survival, and mutual aid, echoes in the DNA of everyone who came after. You learned that winter isn't just weather. It's a test of everything humans can endure when they work together. And somehow, impossibly, your communities passed that test for nearly 1,000 years before the world changed forever. The skills you mastered, the relationships you built, the knowledge you preserved, all of it became part of the foundation that later generations built upon. You proved that people can survive almost anything when they combine practical knowledge, community solidarity, and the determination to keep going even when hope seems impossible. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow's spring might finally come, bringing with it the possibility of rebuilding something new from the ashes of everything you've lost, carrying forward the best of what you learned about survival, community, and the incredible resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges